Hello everybody. Since we're really close to the Unit 1 endocrine exam deadlines, I thought I would spend a little bit of time reviewing endocrine with you. If you care to watch the video, I've got some practice questions for the endocrine physiology test. I don't have any for the endocrine anatomy test. I think that one's a little bit more straightforward. The physiology is usually the side that's a little bit more difficult for most students. But let me go in here and go back into Unit 1 and just make sure you still remember all of the resources and so forth you should be using to help you study. Of course, your Mastering A&P homework will be due as well, and you can return to those questions. I mean, even after you've completed them and submitted the assignments, you can go back to those and continue to practice with those questions. You know, after you've reviewed the material, the best thing you can do is quiz yourself by using all these review questions as much as you can. If you didn't read through these tasks for Unit 1, it's kind of late, but please be sure to go through those. For over here on the anatomy side, of course, be sure you go through, click and open the Unit 1 anatomy module and, you know, review all of that. But this L activity here, Bio 202 endocrine anatomy review, you know, you want to be sure you use this activity. These are excellent practice questions, very similar to those that you're going to see on the actual test. This is really going to help you. They're not identical, but they're going to give you a feel for what to expect on the test. And many of these ask you to type in the identification or the identity of an endocrine gland or a part of an endocrine gland that you're required to know. And that's going to help you practice your identification and your spelling. And you can do this over and over. It's not required for a grade. It's just going to help you prepare for that Unit 1 endocrine anatomy test. Be sure, too, that you have looked at this Unit 1 endocrine system anatomy study guide, and it's listing everything for you here that you need to know. So don't overlook that as well. Okay, the physiology side is generally the tougher one for most people. All right, of course, you've got all the documents up here, including the Unit 1 Physiology Exam Study Guide that you want to be sure you go through. I did post an endocrine hormone worksheet that you might want to print out multiple copies of. That can help you organize information about particular hormones. Like if your hormone, for example, is growth hormone, endocrine gland that produces it, anterior pituitary, stimulus, what causes an increase in production of this hormone. Well, that's part, and that's going to kind of tie in the case of growth hormone, that's going to tie in with your regulation and control. If you have low levels of growth hormone, that causes the hypothalamus to secrete more GRH hormone. GHRH, the growth hormone releasing hormone. That travels down to the anterior pituitary and stimulates more growth hormone to be released. So that's the type of information you would want there. Targets, muscle, bone. Growth hormone has many, many different targets in the body, and it stimulates growth of those tissues. So those would be your effects. And at a more detailed level, growth hormone tends to cause fat metabolism to take place, synthesis of proteins, things like that. So review the different effects of growth hormone disorders, acromegaly, gigantism, you know, those are the, you know, and kind of summarize the disorders there as well. So you can use those for all the various hormones to help you study. The physiology module, that's where you will find video lectures and some review things in there as well to help you prepare. Now down here at the bottom, the L activity here, Bio 202 Unit 1 Physiology Exam Review. Not for a grade, lots of practice stuff in here that will help you prepare for the Unit 1 Physiology exam. So be sure you go through each page of this review activity to help you review. And the other thing you need to be doing as well, you got 2 sets of clinical questions for endocrine, and then you got the case of the bug-eyed woman right there. Those are all endocrine case studies. The endocrine system is great for clinical applications, and I think the clinical applications can actually help you understand the material better. So be sure you work through those, and we are discussing those over here on Piazza. So like if you click on endocrine clinical question number 1, Herman in a bar fight. Here's the question. Students have been working together to compose a single answer, and these answers are supposed to be very thorough, well written, and they explain what's causing the problem for the patient, why it's happening, you know, from a physiology basis. You're explaining the hormone that's involved, the gland that's involved, and why the patient is having the signs or the symptoms that they're experiencing based on the physiology, based on the function of that hormone or the lack of that particular hormone. What does that hormone normally do? So why is this patient experiencing these symptoms if the patient has too much of that hormone or not enough of it? So you want to make these like ideally they'll come out like the perfect discussion question answers. So you guys can work together on those. And then the bug-eyed woman case study, that's a thyroid disorder case study. And the little red here means that there are 4 questions from that case study that nobody has even attempted to answer yet here on Piazza. So please participate in those because they're going to help you prepare for the Unit 1 Physiology exam, and especially for the discussion questions. Discussion questions won't be identical, but they will address some similar topics. All right, the other thing I wanted to do in this video clip, I've got a few practice questions that I'm going to cover on this video. And what you guys can do while you're watching the video, you can pause the video and try to figure out the answer to the question before I discuss the answer, and this will provide you with some additional practice. And so these are not real test questions, but they may be somewhat similar to things you may see on the test. They're going to ask you about similar concepts, and hopefully by kind of I use these in my traditional classes on campus, and hopefully just by kind of mentally working our way through them, it'll give you a feel for what test questions are going to be like and how you need to think about them when you're answering them. All right, so our first example question here is just about basic hormone biology. So we've got questions about cortisol. Cortisol is a steroid type hormone that is derived from cholesterol. So if you guys remember, you got hormones that are steroids, which are a type of lipid, and then you've got hormones that are amino acid based. Most hormones fall into one of those 2 categories. So let's select all that apply here if cortisol is a steroid type hormone. So if you're thinking about steroid, hopefully you learned back in Biology 201 that steroids are types of lipids, which means they're hydrophobic. They don't like watery-based fluids. And that also means, you know, most of your hydrophobic compounds don't mind diffusing. They're able to diffuse across cell membranes because they can get through the phospholipid bilayer of the cell. They don't mind all those fatty acids in there. They're comfortable wiggling their way through the cell membrane because they're hydrophobic like those fatty acids are. All right, so select all that apply. You will have some of these types of questions on all tests, and how you want to treat those. A lot of students struggle with these questions, and first of all, you got to know the material to be able to answer them. Number 2, don't try to second guess. Don't try to strategize on them. Like if you got 5 answers here, don't think things like, well, he wouldn't have had us pick all 5, or surely only one of these can't be correct, and I'm going to pick a couple of additional ones. And if you do that, you're going to wind up getting into a bind, because if you pick an extra answer that's not correct, you get penalized. If you leave out answers that are supposed to be correct, you get penalized as well. So you can get partial credit on these, but if you just start kind of picking extra things or leaving things out, you'll wind up not receiving much partial credit for your answers. All right, so how about these? Cortisol, steroid type hormone. Best thing to do, just go down A, B, C, D, E, and just treat each one almost like it's a true-false question. And if it's true, then pick it. So will it diffuse inside all cells? Okay, so that one is true. We're going to check that one off. Your steroid type hormones, the hydrophobic ones, diffuse across cell membranes. The blood is delivering these hormones all throughout your entire body. So these hormones are actually going to go inside your cells. Hydrophilic, no, we just said these are hydrophobic. Do they act through second messengers? No, those are your hydrophilic type, usually the amino acid based hormones that bind to a receptor on the cell surface, so they don't actually enter the cell. So because of that, when they attach to a receptor, that triggers a second messenger molecule to be made or released inside the cell that continues to carry out the message and is going to wind up triggering the effect. So second messengers are something that happen with hormones that don't actually enter the inside of the cell. All right, so that one's no. Steroid hormone binds an intracellular receptor. Yes, your steroid hormones enter the cell, they diffuse across the cell membrane. They still have receptors that they have to attach to, but those receptors are inside the cell, usually in the nucleus. The hormone directly binds to genes on chromosomes and causes them to be transcribed. That one might be a little bit tricky. What happens is these types of hormones do cause genes to be transcribed or expressed. They get turned on. So you do transcription and then later translation. So you make a protein of some type. But the hormone does not do that directly. The hormone, here's our hormone. It has to bind to its receptor, and then those two things together attach to DNA, near where you've got a gene. Here's a gene on our DNA. Those two things together as a complex attach, and then you do transcription of that gene, and then you do translation of the gene. So that's how they cause an effect to take place. All right, now we'll put these questions on Blackboard as well, so you'll have these to practice with. Most hormones bind one type of receptor present on very limited tissues in the body. Is that going to be true or false? Most hormones bind one type of receptor. Okay, your answer there is actually false. Most hormones have a fairly significant number of tissues with receptors that they can attach to. Most hormones just have one type of receptor, but most hormones affect a pretty wide array of tissues in the body. Like if you think about something like insulin, impacts lots of cells in the body, lots of tissue. Same thing with growth hormone. Some are more limited, but others are not. All right, select all that are generally true regarding hormones. So here's another select all that apply. Do they act more slowly than nervous system responses? Yes, that's one of the key things that we've learned about hormones. It takes a little while. In order for a hormone to cause an effect, the hormone has to actually be secreted from an endocrine gland and travel to other parts of the body, attach to their receptors, and trigger their effects on a target. So that takes a while. Nervous system functions through these action potentials that happen super, super fast, and so because of that, they're able to trigger their effects really quickly. B, the responses with hormones last longer than nervous system responses. That's generally true. Hormone responses generally last for a much longer period of time. Nervous system responses, the things that they trigger, generally just last very briefly. All hormones have short half-lives. If you guys remember the half-life, that's how long does it take once a hormone has been secreted from a gland? How long does it take for the concentration or the level of that hormone to be cut in half? Is it minutes? Is it hours? Is it days? Whatever that period is called the half-life. So all hormones have short half-lives. That's not true. Some do and some don't. D, down regulation of hormone responsiveness means they are being secreted at lower levels. Kind of the key thing there is hormone responsiveness. If we read that carefully, that's kind of telling us the hormone is still there. It's just that the target cells are not responding as as well. If you guys go back and review the information that we covered, hormone responsiveness is generally more about whether or not the target cells have the receptors. Target cells have to make those receptors for the hormone, so they can make a lot of them, and then they're going to be very responsive, or they might make fewer receptors, and if they do that, they're not going to respond to the hormone as well. Most hormones respond to neural stimuli, which means that a neuron firing an action potential and sending a neurotransmitter over to the gland. Remember that from Biology 201? That would mean that that's happening, and that's what's causing the hormone to be secreted. Okay, that's actually not true either. That does happen in some cases, but not most of them. All right, so let's review some of the major endocrine glands and their hormones and their functions. Let's start with the hypothalamus up in the brain. So like all that are true about the hypothalamus. A, most of its hormones are trophic hormones, or tropic. Sometimes you'll see tropic for that as well. And if you guys remember, tropic or trophic hormones, those are hormones whose targets are other endocrine glands. So if we think about the hypothalamus, what hormones does it actually make? It makes ADH, makes oxytocin, and then it makes several releasing hormones. You know, for example, like growth hormone releasing hormone, or CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Makes a couple of inhibitory hormones, but those releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones, what do they actually act on? What are their targets? So that's some of the information you want to be organizing while you're studying. They travel the short distance. They leave the hypothalamus. They get into the little capillaries, the tiny blood vessels in the infundibulum, that little stalk between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And the target is actually the anterior pituitary. So those hormones are controlling what the anterior pituitary is going to make. So because of that, that is true, most hypothalamus hormones are trophic or tropic hormones. Okay, so B, produces some hormones that are secreted from the anterior pituitary. No, that's false. Now, if this had said posterior pituitary, then yes, that would be true, because the hypothalamus makes ADH and oxytocin, but then those hormones actually get secreted out of the posterior pituitary. Go back and review your diagrams to kind of get a mental visual picture for how all that works if you're confused by that. C, it produces ADH in response to increased osmolarity of body fluids. So what does increased osmolarity mean? That means you have an increase in solute concentration. And if you have an increase in solute concentration, that means the amount of water you have in your body fluids is too low. You have low water levels. So what is it? Now let's ask ourselves, what does ADH do? ADH, target is the kidneys. You're producing urine in your kidneys, and ADH causes the kidneys to absorb water back out of the urine. So your urine is basically filtered blood fluid. The ADH triggers a lot of water that's in your early urine in your kidney, still in the process of being formed, gets absorbed back into your bloodstream and your tissue fluids. So the effect of ADH then is to increase water levels in your tissues. Okay, so does this make sense for the hypothalamus? I would say yes. If you have decreased water levels in your tissues, you're going to need more water. ADH causes you to hang on to more water. So that certainly looks like a good function for ADH. How about D? Produces a hormone that stimulates contraction of smooth muscle cells in the mammary glands. That's true. What hormone is that? Oxytocin, that's one of its functions. OT triggers the smooth muscle cells in the mammary glands to squeeze, and that causes milk letdown. It doesn't trigger milk production. It triggers milk letdown. What hormone triggers milk production, actually making the milk? Anybody remember? Prolactin, or PRL, and that's actually made by your anterior pituitary, so that's a different hormone. Oxytocin stimulates the milk letdown. What else does oxytocin trigger? Uterine contractions as well. Okay, how about E? Most of its hormones enter small vessels that travel through the infundibulum to the adenohypophysis. As if you didn't have enough terminology to remember already, hopefully you remember that the adenohypophysis is another name for your anterior pituitary. So yes, that's going to be true. We just talked about that. Most of the hypothalamus hormones, their target is the anterior pituitary, and so they have to enter the little tiny blood vessels in the infundibulum, and that carries those hormones to the anterior pituitary. So almost all of those were correct. So a lot of taking these tests in the A&P is reading carefully. I advise you to slow down, read carefully. I just did one of these review videos for my Distance Education Biology 201 class, and I was going through and answering a question completely wrong because I didn't read it carefully. I was too busy yakking. And so it's really easy to do. Everybody does it. So just try to slow down and reread, because sometimes when you just reread, you'll catch things that you didn't catch the first time. Or if you're middle-aged or older, I don't know what it is, but you just start reading things wrong as you get older, as many of you are going to find out, maybe in 10 or 20 years or so. You just start reading things wrong. Your brain starts doing strange things at times. Okay, how about this one? Hypothalamic pituitary axis. So this interplay between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Let's select all that are true about growth hormone, GH. Again, multiple answer questions. You want to just go down the list, treat each one like a true false. How about A? Is it secreted from the neurohypophysis? No. Growth hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary. The other name for that is adenohypophysis. The neurohypophysis is another name for the posterior pituitary, because the posterior pituitary is really composed mostly of nervous tissue. B, when levels are high, the hypothalamus secretes more somatostatin. That's also known as growth hormone inhibitory hormone. That's another name. Somatostatin is actually another name for GHIH. So let's just think about it logically. When you're saying somatic, that's generally referring to the body. So somato, body, statin, stationary, you're inhibiting something. And so that's maybe a good way to think about this being growth hormone inhibitory hormone. All right, so if your growth hormone levels, you think about hormone levels fluctuate within a normal range from high to low levels. If growth hormone levels are up here, what do we need to have happen? We need to have them drop a little bit. So yes, the hypothalamus will make GHIH when growth hormone levels are high. GHIH travels to the anterior pituitary and tells the cells in the anterior pituitary that produce growth hormone to stop secreting so much of it. So that one will be true. Growth hormone, does it stimulate protein synthesis? Yes, it does. Stimulates growth, synthesis. You're building things. You're building those filler proteins in your connective tissues and your extracellular matrices across the body. You're building the actin and myosin proteins in your muscles that are needed for muscle contraction. Okay, D, reduces catabolism of fat so that cells will burn amino acids and sugars instead. No, that one's actually false. Growth hormone, one of the things that it does is increases catabolism of fat. So you use that as a source of energy. And you wouldn't want to burn up your amino acids, because with growth hormone, you're often trying to do protein synthesis to build muscle protein to build filler proteins and other types of tissues. So you wouldn't want to burn amino acids to make that, because then you wouldn't be able, amino acids are the building blocks of your proteins. You got to have those around. Overproduction during adulthood causes Hashimoto's disease. No, that's false. Hashimoto's disease is a disorder of the thyroid. It doesn't have anything to do with growth hormone. Overproduction of growth hormone during adulthood. What do we call that? What disorder? That's acromegaly. And that's where you can wind up with bones can thicken, they don't lengthen, so you don't get any taller, but your skeletal frame can become thicker when you have acromegaly. So you'll wind up with a wider skull, a more pronounced brow, more pronounced jaw, thicker limbs. All right, how about F? Low levels of circulating GH will trigger the hypothalamus to secrete GHRH. Yes, that's true. If we think about the up and down fluctuation, if growth hormone levels are down here, we need to make more growth hormone. All right, so GHRH is made by the hypothalamus, travels to the anterior pituitary, and causes the cells in the anterior pituitary that make growth hormone to produce more of it. So that one certainly does make sense. A lot of these things, if you just kind of think through them logically, you can work out the answer. And when you guys are using these example questions, the ones in the review activities on Blackboard and your Mastering A&P homework, these questions, don't just try to memorize answers. That's not going to be very effective, because you aren't going to have these exact same questions. You need to understand why the right answers are the right answers and why the wrong answers are wrong. Think about it that way. Can I explain why this answer is correct? That's what's going to help you remember the material, not just trying to memorize. If I see this question, it's true. If I see this question, this answer is true, this one and this one are true, and this one are false. You got to understand why they're true or false. Okay, the hypothalamus produces two releasing hormones that control hormone production by the posterior pituitary. That one might be a little tricky. Hopefully you said false for that one. The hypothalamus does produce two hormones that get secreted out of the posterior pituitary. Which two are those? ADH and oxytocin. But those are not releasing hormones. The releasing hormones are made by the hypothalamus. They travel to the anterior pituitary, and they trigger the anterior pituitary to produce its hormones, like growth hormone or ACTH or whatever it is we're talking about. The posterior pituitary, if you guys remember, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary over here. We've got our infundibulum leading up to the hypothalamus up here. In your hypothalamus, you've got these neurons that make ADH and oxytocin, and their axons extend. You don't just have two of them, but their axons extend down into the posterior pituitary. Those hormones get stored down here in the little knobs on the ends of their axons, and when you need to release ADH or OT, those hormones come out of those little knobs in the axons. They get into the posterior pituitary tissues, and you have little microscopic blood vessels in there that pick up those hormones. So the posterior pituitary is just the location where those hormones enter the bloodstream. They were actually made by these guys, these neurons that are actually up here in the hypothalamus. All right, Hortense, your pregnant neighbor, has a destructive tumor of her posterior pituitary gland. All right, so remember, destructive tumors are tumors that destroy the endocrine tissues. And so what's that going to do to the hormone levels? So the hormones that are produced by or secreted by the gland are going to drop. So we've got a bad posterior pituitary here. All right, so this one's going to require some critical thinking. So how do we approach this? All right, so if you got a destructive tumor of the posterior pituitary gland, what hormones are going to drop? We're going to have less ADH. We're going to have less oxytocin. All right, so how about A? Will she have elevated glucose levels in her urine? So we have to think about what ADH does. What is its main function? Increases water reabsorption out of the urine, out of the kidneys. So it increases water levels in the body. Oxytocin triggers milk letdown in the breasts and uterine contractions. So those two hormones don't really impact the glucose levels in the urine. So we're going to say no to that. Will she have excessive urine output? Yes, she will. You can't absorb water back out of the urine and into your tissues very well without ADH. So your urine volume is going to increase. You're going to have excessive urine output. That's also why you pee a lot when you drink alcohol, because alcohol inhibits ADH. So if you drink a few beers, you have a mixed drink, some wine, you tend to urinate much more excessively because the alcohol is kind of mimicking what we see here. Will Hortense dehydrate? Yeah, pretty good chance she's going to dehydrate because ADH is really important for you to be able to maintain proper water levels in your tissue. So dehydration would certainly be a problem, just like you can become dehydrated very easily if you drink a lot of alcohol. Failure to go into labor to deliver her rugrat, her baby. I would say yes if you have decreased oxytocin. Oxytocin is important for uterine contractions. Will she have excessive milk letdown from the mammary glands? No. Oxytocin causes milk letdown. So if you have low levels of oxytocin, you're going to have less, not more, milk letdown. How about this one? Hypotension. What does that mean? Low blood pressure. All right, so if you are dehydrating, you're losing water from your body fluids. What's going to happen to your blood volume? Your blood volume, this is good to think about because we're getting ready to start the cardiovascular system in units 2 and 3. That's going to cause your blood volume to go down. So what's that going to do to your blood pressure? Blood volume goes down. There's not as much fluid pressure on the walls of your blood vessels. So that's certainly going to lower your blood pressure. Dehydration lowers your blood pressure. So yes, you may very well develop hypotension in this particular scenario. Think about like a garden hose. If you got lots of water flowing through the garden hose, you're going to have higher water pressure in the garden hose, less water flowing through there, lower water pressure. The water's not going to flow as quickly and as forcefully. It's the same thing with your blood and your blood vessels. So that one's true. How about G? Decreased cortisol production? Unlikely. I would say no. Posterior pituitary is not really dealing with cortisol. And if we think about this a little bit further, cortisol is released due to stress. If you have inadequate ADH, especially the ADH, maybe not so much the oxytocin, but low ADH and having low blood pressure, dehydration all the time, that's a type of stress. That might actually increase your cortisol production. So I think decreased cortisol production here would be extremely unlikely. Let's see. Never mind about the note there. I'll go ahead and edit that out before I post this PowerPoint on Blackboard. That's from an earlier semester. Our answers were B, C, D, and F. All right, here's another one. Select the anterior pituitary hormones that are critical for sperm and egg development. The anterior pituitary hormones. So you have to know which ones are made by the anterior pituitary, which one day we're going to study these hormones and what they do in more detail when we cover the reproductive system at the end of the semester. But for now, we just want to know which ones are involved in sperm and egg development in males or females. All right, luteinizing hormone, or LH, definitely involved in sperm and egg development. That's one thing we have to ask ourselves here. The other thing is it an anterior pituitary hormone? Yes, it is. So we can check that one off. How about gonadotropin releasing hormone? That is important for sperm and egg development, but what gland makes gonadotropin releasing hormone? That's actually the hypothalamus and not the anterior pituitary. So we have to X that one out. Oxytocin, not important for sperm and egg development. It's important for uterine contractions. Plus, oxytocin is secreted from the posterior pituitary, made in the hypothalamus, secreted from the posterior pituitary. Testosterone. Testosterone is important for sperm and egg development. It's not an anterior pituitary hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. Yes, it's important for sperm and egg development. Yes, it's an anterior pituitary hormone, so we can check that one off. How about estrogen? Certainly important for egg development. Not an anterior pituitary hormone, though. Estrogen is mostly made in the ovaries. T3 and T4, thyroid hormones. They probably are important for, T3 and T4 are important for proper metabolism. You need metabolism to be functioning properly for sperm and egg development, so they probably are involved, but they're not anterior pituitary hormones. These are thyroid hormones. Okay, moving on to the thyroid here, a few thyroid questions. We have a patient with an unusual genetic mutation that caused his thyroid parafollicular cells to underproduce their hormone. The parafollicular cells, you've got to know the difference between the cell types in the thyroid. This patient would most likely have low levels of which of these hormones? All right, so the follicular cells are these guys, like right there and right there, the little individual cells that you see. They line the follicles. The parafollicular cells are actually out in here in these gray connective tissues that fill up the spaces in between those follicles. So para a lot of times means next to something else. So the parafollicular cells are not the same as the follicular cells. They make a different hormone. All right, so in this patient would likely have a low levels of which hormone? How about PTH, parathyroid hormone? No, because the parathyroid glands make PTH, not the parafollicular cells of the thyroid. How about calcitonin? Yes, that's an answer there. Calcitonin is made by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid. Glucose, would the patient have low levels of glucose? No, as far as we know, calcitonin doesn't have anything to do with glucose. TSH. TSH is produced by what gland? Anterior pituitary. And what triggers TSH levels to go up? If you had low T3, T4, that's going to trigger an increase in TRH by the hypothalamus. That's going to travel to the anterior pituitary and cause TSH levels to go up. TSH does not act on the parafollicular cells. The target of TSH, these follicular cells, these follicle cells in the thyroid, not the parafollicular cells. So TSH really doesn't have anything to do with these parafollicular cells, so we can rule that out. All right, E, all of these would be low. We've X'd several of them out, so we know that one is not true. So our answer there is calcitonin. Function of calcitonin, in the past, it was thought that calcitonin played a pretty significant role in decreasing calcium levels in your body fluid and triggering bone matrix production, if you guys remember that from Biology 201. But in humans, it's really thought that calcitonin doesn't have much of a function. In some other types of animals, it's a lot more important for proper bone growth and development. But in humans, it doesn't really seem to do all that much. Okay, thyroid. Continued here. Chuck has cytotoxic T cells, and we haven't learned about those yet, but cytotoxic T cells are cells of the immune system that kill other cells. So Chuck has some cells of his immune system, these T cells that attack and destroy the follicular cells in his thyroid. Select all that applies. So the follicular cells in the thyroid are going to die, so we have to be able to think through what's going to happen there. What do the follicular cells in the thyroid produce? Because they're going to be killed. So that's going to help us kind of think through this scenario. What do we know about these guys? They produce thyroglobulin, if you guys remember. Thyroglobulin is a protein that accumulates inside those follicles, inside that colloid, that jelly-like filling in the follicles of the thyroid. And thyroglobulin, your T3 and T4, those thyroid hormones, are clipped off of the thyroglobulin. So if we think through this logically, if a patient is losing follicular cells, they're going to have decreased thyroglobulin, and in turn, they're going to have decreased T3 and T4. And then what are the functions of T3 and T4? Thyroid hormones. What do they do? Their effects: increased metabolism. All right, so think through things logically like that. Kind of put things down that you know, all right, I don't have a lot of follicular cells because they're being killed. You know, these are the things I know about the follicular cells. These are the effects I would expect. And then we can go through and select the things that apply here. How about A? He will have a low metabolic rate. I would say that's going to be true. He's got low T3 and T4. That's going to cause low metabolism. He will have hypertension. Hypertension is high blood pressure. We're going to say no to that one. Low metabolism tends to lower your blood pressure. Your heart rate slows down. Lower heart rate leads to lower blood pressure. Low metabolism, you don't have to circulate nutrients and oxygen gases quickly through the body because your cells and tissues are so inactive. So you would not expect hypertension or high blood pressure in this particular case. How about he has Hashimoto's disease. Has Hashimoto's disease. Think about that one. That one's actually true. Hashimoto's disease, that's what this is. You've got these cells that are attacking, these T cells are attacking the follicular cells of the thyroid, so we can check that one off. We said no. Come on, pen, stop behaving. His TRH and TSH levels will be low, so we have to think about this. All right, so if T3 and T4 are low, what causes TRH and TSH to go up? Low T. If we go back and study your negative feedback, if T3 and T4 are low, the hypothalamus senses that and cranks out more TRH, which leads to more TSH being secreted as well. So no, if your T3 and T4 levels are low, you're going to expect TRH and TSH to be high, not low. He has a form of myxedema. That one is true because myxedema is another term for hypothyroidism. This patient has low thyroid function, and that's hypothyroid, not hyper. And myxedema is another term for some of these cases. His LATS test, this gets into the case study the bug-eyed woman case study, his LATS test results will be positive. So if you've looked up some of the information with the bug-eyed woman case study, you know LATS tests, positive results, that occurs in Graves' disease, which is a type of hyperthyroidism, not hypo. He likely experiences chills. Is he having chills? Let's think about this. What do we think here? You've got hypothyroidism, and what's going on with your body temperature? You got low metabolism. More metabolism generates more body heat. So low metabolism, you're going to be cold. Chills are a way for your body to try to warm itself back up. So it would not be unexpected for this patient to have chills. Chills are involuntary, like shivering, involuntary muscle contractions that get triggered to try to help warm your body back up. So if you have a low body temperature, you might expect to have some chills. All right, Ernestine has a proliferative tumor in her anterior pituitary and also has very high levels of T3 and T4 in her bloodstream. Select all that apply. So this is a question like the ones in the bug-eyed woman case study. So you have to think through what's going on with the thyroid hormones and their negative feedback control with TRH and TSH to answer these. And then you also have to think about a proliferative tumor, which proliferative tumors tend to produce excessive amounts of their hormones, and they usually ignore negative feedback, proliferative tumors of endocrine glands. Destructive tumors underproduce their hormones. They don't produce normal levels of them. All right, so if Ernestine has a proliferative tumor in her anterior pituitary and she has very high levels of T3 and T4 in her bloodstream, what's going on here? All right, what hormone made by the anterior pituitary impacts T3 and T4? Hopefully you're thinking about TSH. So TSH levels are high, and in turn, that's causing T3 and T4 to be produced at high levels. Remember, the TSH is acting on those follicular cells in the thyroid, and they make that thyroglobulin. That is a precursor. That's a protein from which T3 and T4 are clipped off or made. So you're also going to have increased thyroglobulin in this scenario as well. All right, how about A? She likely has elevated TSH. We've already talked about that. Proliferative tumor is generally going to overproduce TSH. What about this one, TRH? If we looked at her hormone profiles and we looked at TRH, would we expect elevated TRH? Is the hypothalamus affected by this tumor? There's no information here telling us that the hypothalamus is affected, so it's probably functioning normally. Since we have high T3 and T4, high T3 and T4 causes TRH levels to drop because we don't want to continue making lots of T3 and T4. So due to negative feedback, high T3, T4 is going to cause your TRH to go down. So that one is going to be a no. She likely has a goiter, increased thyroid size. That's due to accumulation of that thyroglobulin inside the thyroid follicles. Yeah, she's very likely to have that going on in this case because she's overproducing these thyroid hormones. She will likely have hypercalcemia. No, which hormone increases calcium levels in the blood? That's your PTH, parathyroid hormone, and that's the parathyroid glands are not part of the thyroid. They have nothing to do with these thyroid follicles that we're talking about. Her LATS test will be positive. Nope, if you go back and read in that bug-eyed woman case study, LATS tests coming out positive is very specific for Graves' disease. That's where your immune system is making antibodies that mimic TSH. They're not TSH, but they attach to the receptors for TSH on the thyroid follicles, and mimic the TSH, and they cause the follicles to keep making lots and lots and lots and lots of T3 and T4, and that leads to Graves' disease. So that's not what we have going on here. This patient has a tumor of the anterior pituitary. This is a completely different condition, even though many of the signs and the symptoms will be similar. She will likely have exophthalmia. Don't worry about exophthalmia. I don't recall that I even put that in the video lecture about the thyroid. That is a term, maybe mentioned though in the bug-eyed woman case study now that I think about it. That's the bulging eyes that can occur in patients with hyperthyroid problems. And yes, it could occur in this patient because that's just the clinical term for the bulging eyes. She will likely have elevated body temperature. Yes, high T3 and T4 increases metabolism. Increased metabolism increases body heat. So people who have hyperthyroid often feel hot. All right, the parathyroid, Lurleen, was attacked by a microscopic monster that ate her parathyroid gland. Select each of the following that are likely to occur in poor Lurleen. All right, so parathyroid glands produce PTH, so we would expect low PTH. And then what's the normal function of PTH? The normal function of PTH is to increase calcium levels in your bloodstream and your body fluids. So if you're lacking PTH, what is Lurleen going to have? She's going to have low calcium levels in her body fluids. All right, so A, will she have hypercalcemia? No. Will she have hypocalcemia? Yes, that's low calcium. So that's what we just said would likely happen. Will she have a high basal metabolic rate, BMR, high metabolism? Not likely. Parathyroid is not affecting metabolism. Metabolism, think T3 and T4 from the thyroid. Will she have high levels of parathyroid stimulating hormone? That one's kind of tricky. You might think so, but there is no parathyroid stimulating hormone. We didn't learn about a parathyroid stimulating hormone. We learned about a thyroid stimulating hormone, but not parathyroid. Will she have reduced absorption of calcium from the intestinal tract? So if you remember, one of the functions of PTH raises calcium levels in your body fluids, and it does that through various things that are going to cause that increase. And one of those is triggering absorption of calcium through the small intestine. So you're absorbing more calcium from your diet. So if you lack PTH, you're going to have reduced absorption of calcium. That's certainly likely. Decreased conversion of vitamin D to calcitriol. If you guys remember, that's another thing that PTH does. It triggers vitamin D produced in the skin or absorbed from dairy products and so forth to which vitamin D has been added. You have cells in the liver and the kidneys that convert vitamin D to calcitriol. That's the active form. And calcitriol, you guys know that vitamin D is involved in calcium absorption, and it's the calcitriol form that does that. The calcitriol tells your intestinal tract to absorb more calcium from the diet. So low PTH is going to cause lower levels of calcitriol to be present in our bodies. Likely to develop osteoporosis. So if you guys remember, you maybe remember this from Biology 201, PTH stimulates cells in your bones called osteoclasts to dissolve bone matrix and release calcium into your bloodstream and your body fluids to help raise the calcium levels up. So in this scenario, Lurleen has low PTH. So the osteoclasts are not being told to break down her bone matrix. So she's very unlikely to develop osteoporosis because her osteoclasts are not going to be dissolving bone matrix. So actually the opposite would probably happen. In Lurlene's case, she might be less likely to develop osteoporosis, but having low PTH is very bad news. She's going to have lots of other problems, and probably won't benefit from not developing the osteoporosis. Okay, here's an adrenal gland question. Be sure to review the different zones of the adrenal cortex, the zonas, and also review the adrenal medulla and what it makes. How about this one? Overproduction of hormones from the zona glomerulosa will cause what? So if we review your different sublayers of that adrenal cortex, you've got the zona glomerulosa, you've got the zona fasciculata, and you've got the zona reticularis. The zona glomerulosa, what's the main hormone we learned about being produced there? Hopefully you're thinking about aldosterone. All right, and aldosterone increases sodium levels in our body fluids. It helps recover, kind of like ADH, you recover water out of the urine that's being made in the kidneys. Aldosterone, you recover sodium back out of the urine being produced in the kidneys. And in turn, remember, water follows sodium ions. That's the key ion that influences water levels in different body compartments. So if you're hanging on to more sodium in your body fluids, water's going to follow. So you'll have increased water levels as well. All right, so if you're making too much aldosterone, we've got overproduction of zona glomerulosa hormones. Let's see which of these would be correct. Well, we expect high levels of potassium in extracellular fluids. No, that one's going to be false. Aldosterone causes higher levels of sodium in our extracellular fluids. So actually C is the correct answer. We can see that there. Hypercalcemia, no, aldosterone does not impact calcium levels. And hyperglycemia, that's high glucose. And aldosterone does not impact glucose levels. So our answer there is C. All right, a proliferative tumor of the zona reticularis in a young male could lead to, okay, and the zona reticularis or reticularis, we have a, what does it make? It makes those androgens, male sex hormones, and so a proliferative tumor, remember, overproduces those hormones. So you're going to have a young male who hasn't reached puberty yet and is going to wind up making large amounts of male sex hormones at too young of an age. All right, so A, development of feminine traits, no. High blood sugar, no. This part of the adrenal gland is not involved in blood sugar control. Cushing syndrome, no. Early onset of puberty, yes. We could have early onset of puberty in this particular patient because they're producing very high levels of male sex hormones, which ordinarily would not occur until the testes start making those at puberty in a male. So that would be your answer to that question. All right, your patient has a puffy face and a noticeable hump of fat on his upper back. Which of the following do you expect to be happening in this patient? Okay. What condition is this? Lots of fat being deposited in places where it's normally not deposited, especially like the upper back. Puffy face, it's a swollen tissues. Those are key symptoms for Cushing's disease, which is an overproduction of mainly cortisol. If you guys remember, stylus is not writing here, behave. Cushing's disease, we have elevated cortisol production from the adrenal cortex. Will this lead to hyperglycemia? Would you expect that in this patient? If you have high levels of cortisol, stress hormone. Yes, if you go back and look, one of the things that cortisol does is it elevates blood sugar levels. Cortisol is a hormone that is supposed to help you deal with long-term periods of stress. If your cells and tissues are under stress, you're going to need elevated glucose to help them deal with that stress. So cortisol will elevate your blood sugar levels. Increase susceptibility to infections. Yes, cortisol actually reduces your immune system function. So elevated cortisol can lead to you not being able to fight off infections as easily. High levels of fatty acids in the bloodstream. Yes, cortisol triggers fatty acids to be released out of your fat tissues and into the blood, and then that's why they tend to accumulate in other locations where they don't normally accumulate. Would you expect hypotension in this patient? Not likely. These patients tend to have elevated glucose in the blood. Glucose is a solute. Water follows solutes. So if you have elevated glucose in your bloodstream, you're going to have elevated water, elevated blood volume. And like we were talking about earlier, if you've got elevated blood volume, that's likely to cause hypertension and not hypo. High levels of glucagon in your bloodstream. Think about what glucagon does. Glucagon is released when blood sugar levels are high or low. Low. Glucagon is released when blood sugars are low. And the function of glucagon is to try to help you increase your blood sugar levels, right? So your blood sugar levels are already high in this condition, so we would not expect high levels of glucagon. All right, now I may have mentioned in the video lecture that a lot of Americans are believed to have unnaturally high levels of cortisol, even without having the condition of Cushing's disease. It's thought that a lot of Americans with our lifestyle and diet and so forth have elevated levels of cortisol because we're kind of under, many of us are under stress a lot of times during our lives, and longer term stress causes cortisol to be released. And so you start thinking about, well, some of those things with Cushing's disease, and not at such an extreme, but many Americans experience some of those symptoms pretty frequently, like the elevated blood sugar levels, the high blood pressure. And so this elevated cortisol that many of us are walking around with quite a bit of the time might be contributing to that. Okay, Irene seems wigged out all the time and shows many signs of ongoing fight or flight stress. Which of the following do you suspect? All right, fight or flight stress. What hormones did we learn about being released due to the fight or flight response? Hopefully you're thinking epinephrine and norepinephrine right here. Those are produced by the adrenal medulla in addition to your sympathetic nervous system, but we mainly study the adrenal medulla here as part of the endocrine system. So you would expect that she's having overproduction of those hormones by the adrenal medulla in this particular case. And there are tumors that can grow in the adrenal medulla and constantly produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. So imagine how you feel when you're frightened, super stressed out. Those types of patients can feel like that all the time, like they're in that stressed out fight or flight type condition. It's not going to be Cushing's syndrome. That's an overproduction of mainly cortisol. Aldosteronism is overproduction of aldosterone from the the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal gland. Mixed edema is hypothyroidism, so you would certainly not expect these types of symptoms with that. Diabetes insipidus, remember that? That's not the same as diabetes mellitus, where you have elevated blood glucose. Diabetes insipidus occurs when you don't produce enough what? ADH. That's a condition if you have like a blow to the head and your posterior pituitary, hypothalamus are injured and you're not producing ADH properly, that leads to diabetes insipidus. The diabetes part refers to excessive urination. Patients with diabetes insipidus urinate a lot due to lack of ADH. Patients with diabetes mellitus also urinate a lot, and that's because of the excessive glucose in their urine. That's a solute. Water is attracted to the glucose, increases the urine volume, and they pee a lot all the time. So just don't forget that diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus are two very different diseases. They involve completely different glands, and they don't even both involve glucose. Diabetes insipidus is not involved with your high blood glucose levels in any way. So don't confuse those two types of conditions. The thing that they have related to each other is people who have those conditions tend to urinate frequently. All right, select each, next question here, select each hormone that can raise your blood sugar levels when it's secreted. And oops, I clicked on the answers already, but let's just walk through these. How about insulin? That's going to be a no. Insulin, the effect of insulin is to lower your blood sugar levels, not increase it. Glucagon, pancreas releases glucagon. When you have low blood sugar levels, main effects are on the liver, triggers the liver to release glucose to help increase those levels. Epinephrine, any stress hormone is going to trigger an increase in blood glucose to help you deal with stress. Your cells are going to have to do more metabolism, and they're going to need glucose to make that happen. So both epinephrine and cortisol, those are both stress hormones, short term usually, more long term here, are going to trigger increased blood sugar. Somatostatin, that's not a function of somatostatin. Growth hormone, lots of synthesis takes place, so you're going to need blood sugar to help support all of that. So growth hormone actually does trigger an increase in blood sugar as well, even though that's not one of the main points that we learn about it. PTH does not trigger an increase in blood sugar. It triggers an increase in calcium. All right, select each of the following that are characteristics of type 2 diabetes mellitus. So be sure you review the differences between type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is the juvenile onset. Type 1, you have little to no insulin production. In type 2, you're still making the insulin, but the cells of your body don't respond to it. They ignore it. So that's the key difference between those two. Type 2, traditionally the onset with type 2 has been in adulthood, but we are starting to see more adolescents who are developing that condition. It's generally linked with being overweight to obese, and a diet that's very high in carbohydrates, lots of sugars. Unfortunately, the American diet fits into that category for a lot of people. Okay, so if you have type 2 diabetes mellitus, would you expect to have hyperglycemia? That's high blood sugar, absolutely. Diabetes mellitus is definitely associated with high glucose levels, and that's because in type 2, cells are ignoring the insulin. Insulin is what tells the cells to take up the glucose out of your bloodstream, out of your body fluids. So if they're ignoring the insulin and not doing that, the glucose is going to stay in your blood. With type 2 diabetes mellitus, do we have low insulin levels? Nope. Your insulin levels may be pretty good, but not necessarily, but they may be pretty good. Your cells are just not responding to it anymore. C, lack of response to insulin by many cells. That's true. Is this an autoimmune disease? Is type 2 diabetes a disease in which your immune system causes the problem? Probably not. Type 1, yes. Type 2, no. In type 1, you have the immune system attacks and kills the beta cells in your pancreas that make insulin. That's why you have the low insulin levels. Associated with obesity and poor diet, that's true. Polyuria, what is that? Excess urine output. Yes, both type 1 and type 2 diabetics will have polyuria. And again, that's because ordinarily when the blood gets filtered in the kidneys to make urine, glucose is a valuable nutrient, so that gets taken back out of the urine and put back into your bloodstream so that you hang on to that. But if you have high blood sugar due to diabetes mellitus, your kidneys just can't recover all that glucose out of your urine. So the glucose in the urine attracts water, that increases the volume of your urine, and that's going to cause you to pee more, so you'll have polyuria. Hyperlipidemia, high blood lipids. Absolutely, yes, that's a pretty common problem with both type 1 and type 2 diabetics. If your cells can't use glucose for energy, they're going to have to turn to lipids. That's going to be the next favorite source. And so you will have more of these lipids floating through your blood to try to feed your cells. But unfortunately, when you have that, that's what leads to things like plaque building up in your arteries, the walls of your arteries, all those excessive lipids floating around in your bloodstream. And that's why diabetics, a lot of times, that can be associated with heart disease and other things like that, where the blood flow gets cut off. Okay, that's actually, I know this was a pretty long review, and I don't want to scare you with those review questions. Some of those were pretty difficult review questions because I wanted to use harder ones to allow some time to talk our way through various endocrine hormones and what they do. So some of your test questions will be at that level of challenge, but others are going to be more straightforward than what we saw here. But I hope you can see that with this endocrine physiology, there's a lot of step-by-step processes you've got to put together. You've got to learn these negative feedback pathways, and you got to learn this gland makes this hormone, and here are the targets for this hormone, and these are the responses that are caused by it. And hopefully you're also seeing that you need to kind of keep in mind some very basic concepts in metabolism. Those are summarized in that document that I've posted. Key things to remember about metabolism, or key things to, I can't remember exactly what I called it, but it's posted there along with the other Unit 1 physiology documents, and it's also over on Piazza as well. You know, things like, all right, if you have elevated glucose in your urine or in your body fluids, water is attracted to solutes. That's going to increase your blood volume. Now, those types of concepts are important and are going to come up over and over again. Or if your metabolism is increased, body temperature goes up, which is going to cause flushing and making you sweat. You know, things like that. You want to just keep in mind all the time, because there are those concepts. If you commit those things to memory and get used to applying those types of things, it'll help you a lot with the clinical applications in this class, and also future classes, like when you get into your nursing classes or med school classes, whatever you're planning to go into down the road. Okay, so I know that was long. I hope it was beneficial to you if you stuck it out. If you have any questions, again, I don't mind you guys sending me messages on course messages on Blackboard. I would prefer that you post things to Piazza, because then if you have a question, probably other people have the same question, and then everybody can benefit from the answer. If you're bashful about posting a question on Piazza, you do have an option there to keep your identity anonymous, so you don't have to avoid posting things on Piazza because you don't want everybody to see your name there. So good luck with your studying, and again, let me know if you need any help with either the anatomy side or the physiology side. Take care.